Just after 5 p.m. on Halloween 1957, in a Los Angeles suburb called Sun Valley, 35-year-old Peter Fabiano turned off the lights at his beauty salon, flipped the sign in his shop window from open to closed, and got into his car to begin the short drive home. Peter turned onto a long residential street and pulled into the driveway of a corner house at the end of the block. Peter put the car in park and just sat for a moment. As he stared at the Halloween decorations his wife had hung on the windows, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He couldn't believe this was his house. And to him, his house was sort of a symbol of how dramatically his life had recently changed. Just a few short years earlier, Peter had felt completely lost. He was living by himself and struggling to make ends meet. And that's when he got mixed up with some bad people who said he could make some money working for them. Even though Peter had agreed to do this, he had known it was not a smart decision, and he was quickly proven right when he ran into trouble with the law. Peter ultimately avoided doing jail time, but this had been a wake-up call for him. After that, he had worked hard to clean up his act and to really start planning for his future. And his hard work eventually paid off. Now he was married and ran a successful business, and he owned a brand new home that had literally just been built. In short, Peter Fabiano was living the American dream. And on top of that, he was enjoying the kind of personal freedom that he had personally fought for on the front lines during World War II. Life was good. Peter strolled up his front walkway between the rows of carved Halloween pumpkins and stepped inside his house. His wife Betty walked up to him, carrying a large bucket full of candy, and as she placed the candy on a table near the door, Peter gave his wife a peck on the cheek. Betty smiled and then quickly turned and walked away. And Peter wondered if maybe Betty's smile was forced, and if maybe she was mad about something. As happy as Peter was about his job and his new house in the suburbs, he and Betty's marriage had its share of difficulties. In fact, just that summer, a few months earlier, things had gotten so tense between them that Betty had moved out for a while. But she had come back, and things had really seemed like they were getting better between them. And so Peter decided to ask a simple question just to gauge Betty's mood. He said, "Hey, have any trick-or-treaters come by yet?" And to Peter's relief, Betty laughed and told him it was still too early. All the trick-or-treaters were probably still eating dinner. Peter relaxed, convinced he'd been reading way too much into his wife's smile, and he started to get excited about handing out candy to a parade of children in funny costumes. In the 1950s in the United States, the act of trick-or-treating had really started to become a popular Halloween tradition for children, and the holiday itself was growing into the huge part of American pop culture that it is today. When Peter was a kid, he didn't get to go trick-or-treating. It wasn't really a thing back then. But now, even though he was an adult, he was quite happy to be a part of it, even if his role was just handing out candy. Peter's teenage stepdaughter, Judy, came bounding out of her room in full costume, dressed as Alice from Alice in Wonderland. She said she was heading out to a Halloween party, and she had a ride there, but she would need a ride home. Peter said no problem, he'd come pick her up, but no later than 10 p.m. because it was a school night. Judy huffed and said fine before telling him where she'd be and walking out the door. By 6 o'clock, shortly after Judy had left for her party, the sun was setting and the Fabiano's doorbell rang for the first time that night. Peter and Betty heard a chorus of young voices chanting "Trick or treat" from right outside the door. Betty smiled, put on her pointy black witch's hat, grabbed the bucket of candy by its handles, and opened up the door. In front of her stood a little boy in a robot costume, and on either side of him were what Betty assumed were his two big sisters, both dressed as fairies. Betty reached into her bucket and grabbed as much candy as her hand could fit, and then dropped the candy into each of the kids' bags. The kids thanked her and ran off. At this point, Peter walked up behind Betty to look outside, and he saw more children approaching. It looked like it was going to be a busy night. A little before 11 p.m. that night, after the last of the trick-or-treaters had come by the house, and Peter had picked up his stepdaughter Judy from her Halloween party, Peter walked into his bedroom and saw Betty reading in bed. He slipped into his pajamas and yawned. He thought about how he and Betty would have to be up at the crack of dawn tomorrow to get Judy to school, and also then to open the two salons they ran for a full day of appointments. And so all Peter wanted to do was just collapse and go to sleep. And so Peter slid into bed with Betty, but then put her book down on the nightstand and she turned off the lamp. As the couple lay in bed, Peter remarked to Betty that this time of the year was exhausting. Betty agreed. Decorating, hosting, entertaining, these things were hard work. She said now that Halloween was over, they would have to start sending invitations for Thanksgiving. And then as soon as Thanksgiving was over, they wouldn't even have time to breathe before they'd have to start decorating for Christmas and planning their big Christmas party. Peter joked that maybe next year they should just board up their house for the holidays and take an extended vacation. Betty started to laugh, but before she could say anything else, their doorbell rang. Peter sat up, switched on the lamp, and looked at the clock. It was 11:15 p.m. He turned to Betty and said it seemed really strange that somebody would ring their doorbell so late. Betty thought it might just be a late trick-or-treater, even though more than 2 hours had passed since the last trick-or-treater had come by. Peter pushed himself out of bed. Maybe it was one of the earlier visitors coming back for seconds, he said. If so, it was their lucky night, because they still had more than enough candy to last through the new year. Peter put on his robe, stepped into his slippers, and began walking towards the front door. And as he did, the doorbell rang again. And this time, Peter heard "trick or treat" from a voice calling out from the other side of the door. And so Peter picked up the bucket of candy on the side table, reached for the doorknob, and pulled the front door open. A few minutes later, Sun Valley police officer Bud Alper was fast asleep in his bed, 2 doors down from Peter and Betty's house, when suddenly this violent pounding noise jolted him awake. The pounding persisted as Alper slowly gained his bearings, and he realized that somebody was banging on the front door of his house. Alper picked up his watch from the nightstand and looked at the time, and when he saw how late it was, he instinctively began reaching for his service revolver. He had no idea what was going on, but someone banging on his door this late definitely couldn't be something good. But just then, he heard the sound of a young woman's voice, tearfully calling his name, pleading with him to open the door. Alper opened his front door, and through bleary eyes, he saw his teenage neighbor, Judy, the daughter of Betty Fabiano, standing there in her nightgown with tears streaming down her cheeks. Judy begged Alper to help her. Her stepfather had been shot, she said. He was lying on the floor of their house, dying. Alper ran out of the house and followed Judy to her front door and stopped just outside the doorway. Alper saw Peter lying motionless on the floor, partially blocking the entrance to the house. Alper quickly stepped over him and darted inside the house, and he saw Betty, Peter's wife, standing frozen in the hallway with her hand over her mouth, looking like she was in shock. Alper asked where their phone was, and Judy pointed towards the kitchen. Five minutes later, an ambulance pulled up at the Fabiano's house, and paramedics picked Peter up, put him on a stretcher, and sped away to the hospital. Officer Bill Lehman of the Sun Valley Police Department parked his cruiser at the Fabiano house just as the ambulance left, and he walked up to the front door. Lehman greeted his fellow officer, Bud Alper, who was standing on the walkway in his pajama robe and lighting a cigarette. Standing near her was Mrs. Fabiano, who was sobbing, and when Officer Lehman approached her, she began to recount what had happened. Betty said that shortly after she and her husband had gone to bed, their doorbell had rang, and they both assumed it was just a late trick-or-treater. Betty said she had stayed in bed while Peter had gone to the door. From bed, Betty had heard her husband open the front door and say, "It's a little late for this, don't you think?" She then heard someone with a strange voice reply, "No," and a few seconds later, Betty heard a loud pop, followed by a thud. As Betty got out of bed and began running to the front of the house, she heard tires screeching and a car speeding away, and there, at the foot of the front door, she found her husband lying on the rug, bleeding from a wound in his chest. Betty told the officer that, based on the tone of her husband's voice after he opened the door, she was pretty sure that whoever he was talking to at the door was an adult, and she could almost swear that the voice she heard in response to him sounded like a man impersonating a woman. Lehman furrowed his eyebrows as he jotted down this strange detail in his notepad. Was the person at the door using a fake voice, because Peter would have recognized them otherwise? And if this was the case, did it mean they were also wearing some sort of costume? It was Halloween after all. Lehman walked back to his cruiser, reached inside of it, and then returned to the front door with a small box. He placed the box over the doorbell and secured it there with some tape. That way nobody could touch it before crime scene investigators showed up to dust for prints. Officer Lehman turned to Betty and asked if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt Peter or wanted Peter dead. Betty hesitated just for a second and then shook her head. She said she couldn't think of anybody. A short time later, homicide detective Pat Keeley rolled up to the Fabiano house and took over the investigation. Officer Lehman briefed Detective Keeley on the details of what had happened, and then Keeley approached Betty. He took off his hat, lowered his head a bit, and said he hated to have to tell her this, but her husband Peter never regained consciousness, and he was pronounced dead upon arrival at the hospital. Betty immediately broke down and began crying, and hugged her daughter. Keeley stepped away to give the victim's grieving family members some space, and as the crime scene investigators showed up to process the scene, Keeley walked across the street to begin his neighborhood canvass. Keeley knocked on the door of the Fabiano's adjacent neighbors and asked if they had seen or heard anything suspicious. The neighbors told the detective that they had heard a loud pop, maybe about 15 minutes earlier, but aside from that, they hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. As the detective scribbled this into his notepad, the neighbor suddenly remembered something he didn't think much of at the time. He said a couple of times that evening, when he would look out the window to see if there were any more trick-or-treaters coming, he noticed a car parked in the street that he'd never seen before. It was an older model, dark-colored sedan, and by his count, it had been parked there for maybe at least an hour, but now it was gone. The neighbor wished he could provide more information, but he didn't take note of the make or model, and he wasn't able to offer a description of anybody in the car. Keeley continued canvassing the neighborhood, but none of the other people on the block saw or heard anything unusual. So he returned to the Fabiano house, hoping that the crime scene investigators had found something useful that might help him close this case quickly. But the news from the other investigators was equally disappointing. There were no fingerprints on the doorbell, and no shell casings at the scene. In fact, they hadn't uncovered anything at all, not a single piece of evidence. This crime scene was totally clean. A little later that night, Keeley returned to his desk in the homicide department to begin writing up the report. The 46-year-old veteran took a deep breath and exhaled in a long sigh. He knew he was in for a long night, and he was at an age where he was beginning to wonder if his 95% homicide clearance rate was worth the toll these long nights must be taking on his health. Keeley finished writing up the report and then began looking over what he'd written. He kept thinking how unusual it was that the killers took advantage of Halloween and used trick-or-treating as a ruse. He'd never heard of this happening before, except maybe in a radio play he once listened to. And the crime scene was so spotless. The killers were very careful to not leave anything behind. This suggested a level of planning and organization rarely seen in random killings and robberies. This had all the markings of a professional hit. The day after the murder, Detective Keeley drove down to the Hall of Justice and made his way to the Records Division. He wanted to find out if Peter had any sort of criminal background or maybe a connection to the mob that might have led a professional hitman to show up at his door and kill him. Keeley asked the records clerk for anything he could dig up on a Peter R. Fabiano. The records clerk disappeared into a back room, and a short time later, he returned with a file and handed it to Keeley. And the second Keeley opened that file up and began reading, he knew his instincts had paid off. Peter Fabiano did have a criminal record. About 9 years earlier, Peter had been a bookie, which meant he was setting up gambling bets, taking bet money, and paying out winnings. This was illegal, and Peter had been caught and convicted on a bookmaking charge. He was sentenced to 180 days in jail, but the sentence was ultimately suspended, and he never served any time. Keeley knew that bookies were often associated with organized crime, and he wondered how deep Peter's ties went. Could he have run afoul of a loan shark, or fallen in debt to the wrong people? Something like that would definitely support his professional killer theory. Detective Keeley spent the afternoon probing Peter's business records, his finances, his background, hoping to find other investigations and other shady dealings. Anything that might help Keeley build a list of Peter's potential enemies. But much to Keeley's surprise, aside from that one scrape with the law being a bookie almost a decade earlier, Peter really did seem to have cleaned up his life. He ran a legitimate business, which his wife helped him operate, and none of Peter's friends that Keeley had talked to could think of anyone who had beef with him. However, Keeley had yet to really have a deep conversation with the one person closest to Peter, and that would be Peter's wife and now widow, Betty. That evening, Betty Fabiano sat in a small room inside the Sun Valley Police Station. After waiting for a few minutes on her own, Detective Keeley walked in, sat down in a chair a few feet away from her, and asked her to take him through the night of Peter's murder again. Betty started recounting everything that had happened that day, starting from when she had finished working at one of the two salons she and Peter owned. Peter, at the time, was working at the other salon. Keeley listened closely, looking for any inconsistencies between this version of events and the story Betty had told him when he had first come to her house. Keeley was not ready to write off the idea that a hired killer had shot Peter, but maybe it wasn't the mob that hired them. Maybe it was the victim's wife. But as Betty spoke, Keeley didn't catch anything that strayed too far from her original story. Still, that didn't necessarily mean anything. Some people were good at memorizing stories. And so Keeley asked Betty to tell him more about her marriage to Peter. Betty explained that she and Peter had been married for about 3 years. She had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and one of those kids, her daughter Judy, lived with them. Keeley asked if she and Peter had any problems in their marriage. Betty paused, then took a deep breath, and admitted that, yes, there had been some marital problems. She said their marriage had become pretty rocky earlier that year, to the point where they actually had separated for a couple of months. Betty had moved out of the house during that time and went to live with a friend. But in July, she and Peter had reconciled, and she had moved back in with him. Betty looked away for a minute and was silent, and then she turned back to Keeley and said there was someone he should know about, someone who might have had it out for Peter. Keeley leaned in and asked her why she hadn't said anything about this person when he talked to her at the house. Betty said she wasn't trying to hide anything. She'd been in total shock at the house, and she hadn't been able to think clearly. But now that she was talking about her and Peter's relationship, it seemed obvious, because she believed this person truly hated Peter, maybe enough to want him dead. It was a woman named Joan Rabel, who used to work part-time for Peter at one of his salons. But Peter had fired Joan because for some reason he just didn't like her. But Betty did. In fact, the 2 women had quickly hit it off when they first met and had become friends. And this really bothered Peter. In fact, it bothered Peter so much that the friendship between Joan and Betty became a source of tension in their marriage, until Peter ultimately forbade his wife to socialize with Joan. Betty felt she had a right to choose her friends and was not going to let her husband control her, but Peter was insistent until Betty felt like he was basically giving her an ultimatum. And ultimately, this is the issue that led Betty and Peter to separate for those several months. However, Betty said after a couple of months of separation, she had a change of heart and returned home to Peter. And he accepted her back, but under the condition that she never see Joan and never even speak Joan's name around him again. As Keeley listened to the story, he found himself puzzled by it. It sounded like there had to be a piece missing somewhere. And so he asked Betty, why did Peter hate Joan so much? But Betty just sort of shrugged and looked away. Keeley couldn't tell if Betty was hiding this information because she knew more about Peter's murder than she was saying, or if she was trying to hide something to protect her dead husband or her friend Joan. Finally, Betty broke the silence and just said that Joan had a really strong personality, and Peter also had a strong personality. And sometimes 2 strong personalities can clash. The next morning, 2 days after Peter's murder, Keeley and his partner decided to pay Joan a surprise visit. They drove to Joan's house in Hollywood, on the other side of the hill, and knocked on her front door. The door swung open and Joan appeared, and as the detectives flashed their badges and said they were there to talk to her about Peter Fabiano, they watched Joan closely to see how she would react, whether she'd be nervous or surprised or something. But Joan just shook her head and looked down. She had already heard the news. How tragic, she said to the investigators. Keeley agreed and said it was tragic, but also her name had come up as a potential suspect, so they needed her to accompany them down to the station and answer some questions. Joan matter-of-factly just said, okay, and asked them to hold on a minute while she got her coat. And as she did that, the investigators shared a look, because honestly, this seemed really strange to them. In almost every homicide case they had ever worked, when somebody was told they were a potential suspect, they got scared or angry or had some kind of strong reaction. Neither of the cops had ever seen someone act so unaffected by this kind of news. They followed Joan inside the house and kept an eye on her while she grabbed her coat and her purse. And she remained totally calm and cooperative when the detectives walked her to their car and drove her back to the valley to police headquarters. As soon as Joan was sitting down inside of the interview room across from Keeley and his partner, she began to talk. Joan insisted that she had nothing to do with Peter's murder. She was not a violent person, she hated guns. In fact, she had never even touched a gun, not once in her whole life. And as Joan continued to talk, Keeley began to notice her calm demeanor slip just a little. She didn't sound angry, she just sounded sort of surprised. She told the detectives she had no idea what they'd heard or who they'd heard it from, but she had no problem whatsoever with Peter Fabiano. She considered both Peter and his wife Betty to be two of her closest friends, and she had only stopped working at the salon because she'd found another job. So, Joan suggested, whoever was pointing the finger at her, the police might want to take a closer look at them. Keeley and his partner exchanged another brief glance. What Joan was saying was a complete contradiction to what Betty had said. Keeley's partner asked Joan if she had an alibi for the night of the murder. She told them she did. She said she had been home all night by herself, but her car had been parked in the front of her house in her driveway, and she was sure one of her neighbors could confirm that. After speaking to Joan for a bit longer, Keeley had his suspicions, but he had no legal reason to hold Joan, so he gave her a ride back to her house. And after Joan went inside and closed the door behind her, Keeley began knocking on her neighbors' doors. And several of them did confirm what Joan told detectives. On the night Peter died, Joan's car never left her driveway. And considering that her house was 12.5 miles away from the Fabiano house, it did seem likely if she was involved somehow in the murder that she would have had to drive there. Keeley returned to the station, went right to his desk, and shook his head in frustration. Less than 2 days into this investigation, and he felt as though the case was already reaching a dead end. Beyond Peter's brief stint as a bookie, nothing had come up that showed he still had ties to organized crime, or that he owed money to anybody. Betty and Joan had told him wildly different stories about Joan's relationship with Peter, so he figured one of them had to be lying. But the lie didn't have to mean they were connected to the murder. The lie could be for some personal reason. And at this point, there was no clear evidence pointing to either of the women. Keeley definitely couldn't rule them out, but he also couldn't really pursue either of them unless some new piece of information surfaced. So Keeley picked up his case file and began scouring the dozen or so pages he'd put together so far, looking for anything he might have missed. But after an hour of studying the facts of the case, he put down the file and felt no closer to an answer. Keeley's nearly perfect homicide clearance rate, which was a great source of professional pride to him, seemed like it was about to take a hit. Nearly a week after the murder, on November 5th, 1957, Peter Fabiano was laid to rest. Following the funeral, Detective Keeley continued to interview Peter's friends and family, but these conversations never seemed to get him anything new. Several more weeks passed, and no matter how many times Keeley looked over his case file, he didn't get any closer to figuring out who had murdered Peter. And with nothing more to go on, and new cases piling up, Detective Keeley and his team turned their attention to other open investigations. The Fabianos' Thanksgiving dinner that year had one fewer face at the table, and while they ate, there was this sense of despair hanging over all of them. Like Keeley, Peter's family started to feel that Peter's case would just never get solved. But on a day not long after Thanksgiving, in early December, the telephone rang at the Sun Valley Police Department. A muffled voice on the other end of the line told the dispatcher they had a tip in the Peter Fabiano case. The caller said that if investigators went to Bullock's department store in downtown Los Angeles and visited the area with the rented storage lockers, they would find a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. This was the gun that was used to kill Peter Fabiano. The caller then provided a locker number and then hung up without giving their name. The dispatcher took down the information and quickly passed it along to Detective Keeley. Keeley was skeptical that this tip would lead anywhere. Whenever a case was all over the news like this one, he usually got at least one call from somebody just looking for attention. Rarely was a vital piece of information just handed to him. It's never that easy. But Keeley was a diligent investigator who followed up on basically every single lead. And so far, the Fabiano case had offered very few. So this was something worth looking into. So Keeley and his partner drove to downtown Los Angeles, entered the Bullock's department store, and had the locker attendant open up the locker the tipster had indicated. And when Keeley looked inside that locker, he couldn't hide his excitement because there inside of it was in fact a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. Keeley asked the locker attendant whose name the locker had been rented under. The attendant opened a registration book, and when she read the name to Keeley, Keeley had never heard of them before. Keeley put the revolver into an evidence bag and drove it back to the station. He knew he would need to figure out where the gun came from, who the gun was registered to, and if the gun had ever been reported stolen. He also knew there was a good chance the locker had been rented under a false name, but he hoped the gun would still lead him to Peter's killer. So he called the state police and gave them the serial number of this gun. And within minutes, Keeley learned that the gun had been purchased on September 21st of that year, the month before the murder, from a gun shop in Pasadena, about 15 miles away. And the buyer of the gun was the very same person who rented the storage locker where the gun was found. This person had not used a fake name to get the gun or the locker. So Keeley could easily track them down, and he was now almost positive this person killed Peter. That evening, after obtaining a warrant, Detective Keeley and his partner arrested the person who had bought the gun and stored it in the locker. The detectives brought this person to the station and sat them down in the interrogation room, and as soon as the interview began, this person openly admitted to shooting Peter Fabiano. And they would tell investigators the entire story right from the very beginning all the way up to the aftermath of the killing. And once Keeley and his partner had all these details, all the pieces began falling into place, and everything that might have confused Keeley early on now suddenly made perfect sense. Based on the killer's confession and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Peter Fabiano on the night of October 31st, 1957. At around 9 p.m. that night, the killer, wearing face makeup and baggy clothes, sat in a parked car a few houses down from Peter's, and just watched and waited. Just after 11 p.m., so after sitting in the parked car for 2 straight hours, the killer saw the bedroom lights in the Fabiano house go off. At this point, the killer slipped a mask over their face and red gloves over their hands, and then climbed out of the car and began walking toward the Fabiano's front door, carrying a brown paper bag with a .38 caliber revolver hidden inside of it. The killer rang the doorbell, and as soon as they did, they began to shake, knowing they were about to commit a crime that could land them in the gas chamber. They tried to calm their nerves by reassuring themselves that this was the perfect crime and there was no way they'd get caught. They repeated this in their head as they rang the doorbell again and called out "Trick or treat" in a loud, booming, unnatural voice. Peter opened the door, looked at the killer in their ill-fitting clothes and paper mask, and laughed. "It's a little late for this, don't you think?" he asked. All the killer could think to say was no, as Peter looked down into his bucket and began fishing for candy. With Peter's attention distracted for just a moment, the killer began raising the gun, which was still concealed inside the paper bag. But as they did, their hands began to tremble violently, so they reached over with their other hand to keep themselves steady, and then continued lifting the gun with both hands. And once it was aimed squarely at Peter's chest, they fired a single shot. The bullet blew a hole through the paper bag and slammed into Peter's chest, the round settling just below his heart. Peter looked up at the killer in horror and then clutched his chest as he fell to the ground. The killer immediately turned around, cut across the yard, and ran back to the car. When they got into the passenger seat, they were shaking and on the verge of tears. They couldn't believe they had just killed a man. But the killer then felt a hand on their shoulder. They turned to the driver's seat and saw the woman they loved had a smile on her face. The woman told the killer they had done everything just right. Then she hit the gas and sped away from the neighborhood. It would turn out Peter Fabiano's killer was a woman named Goldine Pizer. She was a 42-year-old lab assistant at a children's hospital, and she had no direct connection to Peter Fabiano. In fact, she had never met him before the night she killed him. She only knew what Peter looked like because another person had driven her by the Fabiano house a week before Halloween and pointed him out. And this other person was Goldine's only connection to Peter, and this other person was the actual mastermind behind the murder. And that was Peter's former employee, Joan Rabel. It turned out that Joan and Peter's wife Betty had both lied to police about their relationship. Joan and Betty were not just friends, they were lovers. But in 1957, that was not something most people would accept, so Betty and Joan tried to hide it. However, Peter still found out about their relationship, and when he did, he was livid. He fired Joan from his salon and forbade his wife from ever seeing Joan again. But instead of submitting, Betty left her husband and went to live with Joan. However, after a couple of months with Joan, Betty realized she was better off staying with Peter and broke off her relationship with Joan. Betty moved back in with Peter and agreed to never bring up Joan's name again. And it was at this point that Joan began plotting Peter's murder. Jilted and wanting revenge, Joan began a new relationship with the very impressionable Goldine and immediately began setting her up to become Peter's assassin. Joan spoke endlessly to Goldine about what an evil and vile person Peter Fabiano was. Joan claimed Peter was cruel to his wife and cruel to his wife's children, mistreated his employees, and was essentially a monster who needed to be stopped. Over time, Goldine grew to despise Peter just through Joan's portrait of him, and that's when Joan began actively putting her plan into motion. Goldine cared so deeply for Joan, she would have done just about anything for her. And so when she walked into that Pasadena gun shop on September 21st, she felt like she was doing a heroic thing. Once the two conspirators had their plan all worked out, they decided Halloween night was the best time to carry it out, because they knew Peter would be more likely to open his door to a stranger after a steady stream of trick-or-treaters had been to his house. On the night of the murder, Joan borrowed a friend's car, leaving hers in the driveway to create the alibi, and then went to pick up Goldine at her house. Joan then drove Goldine to the Fabiano street, waited in the car until the deed was done, and drove her back home. At which point, Joan told Goldine to forget they ever knew each other and vanished from her life. Once Goldine realized she'd been used and manipulated by Joan, who didn't actually care about her, the hold that Joan had over her was broken. So when Detective Keeley got the anonymous tip and tracked Goldine down, she was more than willing to tell him everything. Joan Rabel and Goldine Pizer were both charged with first-degree murder. Both women initially pleaded not guilty, but eventually changed their pleas to guilty to the lesser charge of second-degree murder. Joan and Goldine received sentences of 5 years to life in prison. As for Peter's widow, Betty Fabiano, she was never charged with any crime because investigators were satisfied that she had nothing to do with her husband's murder. In 2014, Alan Ruby was a 19-year-old freshman studying political science at the University of Oklahoma. Despite being relatively modest and soft-spoken in person, on social media, he projected this lifestyle of wealth and grandeur. He'd oftentimes post pictures of exotic sports cars and expensive watches and clothes, and he would travel the world to Paris, London, New York City, and take all these pictures showing off this incredible life he had. He really wanted people to believe that he was this fabulously wealthy, successful guy. Alan was only able to project this phony lifestyle on social media because he was spending his father's money. His father was a successful businessman who was also the publisher of a newspaper that was quite successful, and so Alan would just spend his money, and then even after his father would give him money, Alan would steal his credit card and additionally rack up thousands of dollars of credit card debt. But as media began to shift away from print media to almost all digital, a lot of newspapers began to fail because they weren't able to transition to digital. And his father's newspaper was not making that transition very well, and they were losing money left and right. And so Alan's father told everybody in his family, with a focus on Alan, that we all need to cut back on our spending because money's tight right now and it's unclear if it's going to turn around. So we got to be careful with how much money we do have. Alan acted like he was going to cut back on his lavish lifestyle, but in reality, he wasn't going to. He was totally addicted to spending money and giving off this vibe that he was so wealthy and successful. And so around this time, Alan steals his grandmother's credit card and secretly leaves the country and goes to Paris to have this vacation on his own. He's taking these pictures in front of the Eiffel Tower and he's spending all this money. And his father finds out that he's stolen this credit card and he's furious. And instead of waiting for Alan to come home and saying, "Don't do that again," he decides he's going to send him a message that he's going to remember. And he calls the police. Alan gets charged with theft, he pleads guilty, and he has to go before a judge who sees that he has no criminal record, so he kind of goes easy on him, and he says that you need to pay back all the money you spent to your grandmother, and you need to go to an addiction program to try to break this habit of yours, to stop spending all this money. After Alan leaves court, his father felt like he finally got the message. It seemed like it had finally gotten through to him that this was a really big problem, and he felt like he had made the right decision in calling the police. But in reality, Alan hadn't changed at all. As soon as he got back from court, he was stealing from people outside of the family. He was taking loans from loan sharks, all of this just to keep up with his phony appearance he portrayed on social media. On October 9th, 2014, Alan owed $3,000 to a particular loan shark and had no way of paying it back. So instead of asking his parents for money, which for him would have been too embarrassing, he decides the best course of action is to kill his entire family. And so he strolls into his home and he shoots his mom dead, he shoots his sister dead, and then he waits for his dad to come home and he shoots him dead because his big plan is, with his whole family gone, he's going to become the sole heir to the family's estate, and that will be enough money to not only pay off this $3,000 debt, but have a little left over so he can go on vacation to Paris again. So after he's committed this horrible crime, he leaves his family where they are. He goes and takes the surveillance footage from inside the house. It was on a DVD, takes the DVD out, takes the murder weapon, leaves the house, chucks the DVD and the weapon into a lake, and proceeds to drive to Dallas, where he checks into a very fancy hotel and meets up with friends and parties the whole weekend. His friends that were with him that weekend would later tell investigators that Alan seemed totally normal. There was no red flags. There was no indication that anything was wrong. He was just laughing it up and having a great time that whole weekend. The following Monday, when Alan's father doesn't show up for work, the police are notified. They go to the house and they find the Ruby family. When police went out and got Alan and brought him back to the station to chat with him and tell him what happened and see if he knew anything, his sad reaction to his whole family now being deceased was apparently so insincere that officers almost immediately assumed that he was probably the guy that did it. Ultimately, Alan would confess, and the prosecutor wanted to push for the death penalty, but Alan's remaining living family members actually said, "Don't do the death penalty. We don't want to risk that not happening. We want to see justice served right now. Can we create a plea agreement where he gets life in jail, but there's absolutely no way for him to get paroled, no matter how good his behavior is, no matter how old he is, no matter what, he can't ever get out of jail." And so they did. They created that plea agreement. They gave it to Alan to sign. He signs it, and as they're walking out of the courtroom, his last remaining family members disown him and say, "May God have mercy on your soul," and they leave.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Western Russian Farm Animal.
At around 9 p.m. on March 3rd, 2022, a 31-year-old woman named Corey Richens tucked her 3 young sons into their beds and then headed downstairs to her kitchen inside of her luxurious home in suburban Utah. Once she got down to the kitchen, she yelled out for her husband, whose name was Eric, to come join her in the kitchen. Corey had some big news that she had just learned that day, and now that their kids were all tucked away in their beds and were off to sleep, she and her husband could celebrate this big news and share a drink together. A moment later, Eric walked into the kitchen and Corey grinned at him and handed him his drink and then gestured for them to go upstairs to their bedroom. And so the two of them went upstairs, they sat down on the bed, and then Corey broke the big news. Corey's tiny real estate company had just found out that day that they were very likely going to close on a deal for this gorgeous 20,000 square foot mansion in Utah for $2 million. Now, Corey knew once she bought this property, she could do a couple of renovations to it and then quickly sell it for $3 million, meaning she was about to make a $1 million profit. Corey had been working really hard on her real estate business for years, but this really represented the first big break. She and Eric lived in a very conservative part of Utah where it was kind of expected that someone like Corey would stay home with the kids and be a good housewife, and that would be her life. But Corey didn't really want that. She wanted to have a professional career that was kind of on par with her husband's. Eric ran a very profitable masonry company that allowed the family to take vacations to Mexico and Spain every year, and also to afford their sprawling property at the end of the cul-de-sac. Corey had stayed home when the three boys were much younger, but now that they were 5, 7, and 9 years old, they had decided to hire a nanny, which had allowed Corey to finally go out and pursue her professional dreams. And so, totally beaming with pride, Corey sat there on the bed and clinked her husband's glass and went over all the details of this deal and talked about how great their lives were about to become with all this additional income. But fairly quickly, both of them decided they were too tired to stay up and celebrate any longer, especially Eric, who earlier that day had gotten an allergy shot and it had totally knocked him out. He was feeling kind of weak and tired. And so the two of them decided to just go to bed. And so after brushing their teeth and changing, they got into their bed, they turned off the light, and they were about to lay down and go to sleep when they heard their 7-year-old crying in his bedroom. And both parents let out a groan, and then Corey, she stood up, indicating she would handle this because they knew often their 7-year-old would have nightmares, and the only way he would go back to sleep was if his mom laid with him. And so Corey, she kissed Eric, and then as Eric rolled over to go to bed, Corey walked out of the room, she went down the hall, went into her son's bedroom, she got under the covers, and then before long, she and her son had fallen asleep. A few hours later, Corey suddenly sat up inside of her son's bed. It was about 3 a.m., and for a second, she couldn't even figure out where she was. The house was silent, it was totally dark, and she was confused. But then she remembered she had gotten up to tend to her son, and so she checked on her son, she saw he was still sleeping, and so she climbed out of the bed, she tucked him back in, she gave him a kiss, and then she left his room, went down the hall, and went back into her bedroom, where she climbed into her bed. Then she saw that Eric had kicked off all the covers, and he was sleeping on his back. And so Corey laid down on the bed and kind of rolled up right against her husband, and she pulled the covers up over both of them, and then she closed her eyes to go to sleep. But right as she did that, she noticed something very strange. Eric's body felt freezing cold. Corey opened her eyes and sat up in bed. She turned over and kind of pushed Eric to see if he would sit up and figure out why he was so cold. But Eric didn't budge, and when she pushed him, he felt really heavy, like dead weight. And so suddenly starting to panic, Corey yelled Eric's name several times, but Eric didn't budge. And so Corey leapt from the bed, she grabbed her phone, and she dialed 911. And when the dispatcher picked up, Corey was so hysterical as she's looking at her husband lying motionless in his bed that she could barely tell the dispatcher what was going on. But finally, she did get it out to the dispatcher, and the dispatcher said, "Stay calm, the ambulance will be there as soon as we can." And so just moments later, Corey heard the sirens outside, and so she ran downstairs, she flung the door open, and practically cried with relief as the paramedics charged into the house. But when the paramedics got upstairs into the bedroom and they went to go revive Eric, they saw right away it was already too late. Eric was dead. First responders had no idea what killed Eric. He seemed like a really healthy, fit guy who actually just the day before had gone for a casual 8-mile run, and he was also this big outdoorsman, always going on hikes and going on these long hunts. And so the idea that this guy had just suddenly died seemed really suspicious. The police did find a painkiller pill bottle on the bedside table next to Eric's side of the bed, And for a second they thought, well, maybe he overdosed on painkillers. But when they looked at the label on this pill bottle, it was immediately clear that this was a really old pill bottle and almost certainly had been empty for some time. When they asked Corey what she thought might have happened, she was totally in shock, but she did say, I don't know. I have no idea what happened to him. But, the day before, he did get that allergy shot and he had a kind of adverse reaction to it and really wanted to go to bed quite early, which seemed odd. But both Corey and the first responders agreed that it seemed pretty far-fetched that an allergy shot would lead to Eric's death. Suicide was also considered a possibility by first responders, but Eric really didn't have any reason to want to harm himself. He was a very devoted and loving father who adored his sons. He coached all their sports teams and went on all these adventures with them and was always out back kicking a soccer ball around with them. And his business was booming, and he had just learned that night that his wife's business was potentially going to start booming as well. And so ultimately, the police told Corey that we're just going to have to open an investigation and try to figure out what happened, and we'll be in touch. And if you think of anything that might help the investigation, please let us know. And Corey said, of course, I'll tell you, but she really wasn't listening. All she was thinking about was her 3 sons who were still sleeping in their beds and had no idea their dad was now gone. Over the next few weeks, while the family waited for autopsy results, Corey really focused her energy on her 3 boys, who were really hit hard by the loss of their dad. Eric had been such a hands-on father that his absence was enormous in these boys' lives. The 5-year-old kept asking, "Where's Dad and when can I see him again?" The older 2 boys, who did sort of understand that their dad was dead, would also ask questions like, well, can Dad still see us, or can Dad still hear us? And these questions broke Corey's heart because she did not have an adequate answer to any of them. And so she tried to find a children's book online and in bookstores that dealt with grief in hopes that that would kind of help her sons deal with what they were going through. But none of the books she got helped at all. And so, a few weeks after Eric's death, when still nobody knew anything about how Eric died or what had really happened, Corey decided that she would take a different approach to helping her sons grieve. Instead of trying to read a book that somebody else wrote about how to handle grief, Corey just called her sons around one night and began telling them a story about their dad. And as she told them this kind of made-up story about their dad being this angel that was taking care of them, she began drawing pictures with a crayon and paper of their dad with wings and a halo, and she'd draw the kids down below waving up at their dad, and she would tell the boys that your dad is an angel now, and he's looking down on you, and he can hear you, and he loves you. And this really seemed to work for the boys. It was like for the first time since his passing that the boys kind of connected with the fact that their dad was gone, but they still had this meaningful connection with him. And so very quickly, Corey's stories about their dad and the illustrations that would go with them became a ritual. Every night, Corey would tell these stories and draw these pictures. And so, as the days and weeks went by, with still no word and no closure about what happened to their dad, Corey had a sort of epiphany. These stories Corey told her kids about their dad and how now he was this angel looking out for them, she could see firsthand how powerful it was and how really it was helping her sons cope with this loss. And she thought, why don't we turn our stories and all these illustrations into an actual grief book for kids? That way other families whose children are dealing with loss can read these stories as well and find some comfort. After all, Corey knew firsthand there really weren't any good grief books on the market. And so she knew for those that needed this, this would be huge. On April 13th, so 6 weeks after Eric had died, and several weeks after Corey and her kids had begun officially writing this kid's grief book, Corey was backing out of her driveway when from the other end of the cul-de-sac, she saw a police car coming down the way, and it was the lead detective on Eric's case, Detective Woody. And as the detective came down the road, he was waving to Corey, clearly getting her to stop for a second. And so Corey, she parked her car, she hopped outside and went up to talk to him. And immediately, Detective Woody got out of his car, he walked up to Corey, and with a grave look on his face, he told her that he had some big news for her and it was going to be pretty upsetting, but he knew he had to tell her in person and right away. He told her that the autopsy results were in, and they determined that Eric had not died of natural causes. He had actually died from a fentanyl overdose. Fentanyl is a very powerful opioid that's often mixed with heroin, and just a little bit of fentanyl can kill someone. And Eric, it would turn out, had 5 times the lethal dose of fentanyl in his system. Corey was totally shocked at this news and told the detective that Eric didn't do drugs. The only drug he did was periodically he would eat a marijuana gummy before bed, but that was it. So this really didn't make any sense. The detective was respectful and kind of nodded his head and said, I totally understand that, but these are the results and we need to find out where he got fentanyl from. And so we're going to need to search all of the electronic devices in your house to see if we can find communication between your husband and whoever got him the fentanyl. Corey told the detective that of course they could do that, but as she began thinking about all of their devices, she suddenly remembered that Eric's business partner, Cody Wright, had actually taken Eric's laptop very shortly after Eric had passed away. Now, Corey didn't know why Cody had taken the laptop, but Cody had been a thorn in both Corey and Eric's side for several years now. Eric and Cody had been very close friends when they had started their masonry business together about a decade earlier, but they'd had a serious falling out a few years back. The two men had been on this elk hunting trip, and at one point Eric had illegally shot and killed a bull elk, and Cody had actually reported Eric after this hunting trip to the game wardens. And as a result, Eric got in a lot of trouble and was temporarily banned from hunting anywhere in Utah. The two men still managed to continue to work together and build their masonry business, but it was very clear their relationship was totally fractured and would never be repaired. Now, Corey didn't get into all the details of the tensions with Cody, but she did tell Detective Woody that, if you want access to Eric's laptop, you gotta go talk to Cody because he took it for some reason. And also, you really just ought to talk to Cody in general because, maybe he has more to do with what happened to Eric and this whole fentanyl thing than he's letting on. The detective told Corey that he appreciated the information and he appreciated being allowed to go in and collect all the devices and that he would go talk to Cody and try to retrieve Eric's laptop. And then after that, the detective thanked Corey and said they'd be in touch soon. But after this conversation with Corey, the investigation into Eric's death kind of stalled out. When police did follow up with Cody, they didn't find anything really worth pursuing. And outside of talking to Cody, no new information came in about Eric's death or about, his connection to fentanyl. And so really there was nothing for police to operate on. And so while the family just kind of waited for more information to come out about whatever happened to Eric, Corey just focused her energy on taking care of her 3 boys and writing this grief book with them. And finally, on March 5th, 2023, so almost exactly a year after Eric has died, and still police have no idea what happened to him, the grief book was finally done, and Corey self-published it on Amazon under the title, Are You With Me? And right away, the book was a total hit with parents of grieving children. And as the 5-star reviews poured in, so too did requests from local media for Corey to be interviewed and talk about this book and why she wrote it and how her kids are doing. Corey had no idea her book would be this successful, and so at first she was really terrified to do any of these interviews, but eventually she decided she would just say yes to all the interviews because she was very proud of what her and her kids had created, and she knew Eric would be proud too. However, what Corey didn't know was there was going to be a massive unintended consequence from publishing this book. Ever since Eric was found dead in 2022, the police in Utah began painstakingly searching all of the electronic devices that the Richens owned and that Cody, Eric's business partner, owned. And basically, they were just looking anywhere for some sign of communication between Eric and whoever had given him the lethal fentanyl dose. And at some point during the search of all these devices, the police found something very unusual. And they knew it very likely had to do with Eric's death. But they didn't really have any evidence to prove that, and so they just had to kind of sit on it and wait to see what happened next. And what happened next was, shortly after Corey published her grief book, it got all this media attention, and in turn, because of this attention, Eric's death, specifically the unsolved nature of his death, also got a lot of media attention. And eventually, several people who kept seeing all this news about Eric's unsolved death reached out to police and said, you know what? He did not overdose on fentanyl. He was murdered, and I'm almost positive I know who did it. And lo and behold, the alleged killer that all these people brought up to the police was the same person that the police in Utah had become suspicious of because of all those unusual things they had found during their search of all of the electronic devices. And so, on May 8th, 2023, not long after getting all these tips about this alleged killer, the police in Utah felt like they finally had enough ammo to go after this person, and they headed out to make an arrest.
I want you to stay till I'm in the grave, till I rot away, dead and buried, till I'm in the casket you carry. If you go, I'm going too, 'cause it was always you. Alright, and if I'm turning blue, please don't save me. Nothing left to lose without my baby. Birds of a feather, we should stick together. I know I said I'd never think I wasn't better alone. Can't change the weather, might not be forever, but if it's forever, it's even better. And I don't know what I'm crying for. I don't think I could love you more. It might not be long, but baby, I'll love you till the day that I die. Till the day that I die. Till the light leaves my eyes. Oh, till the day that I die. Oh, I want you to see how you look to me. You wouldn't believe if I told you.
While we don't know for sure what happened, because again, this story, it's ongoing. This case has not even gone to trial yet. Here is what prosecutors say really happened to Eric Richins on March 3rd, 2022, the night he died. That night, Eric was upstairs when he heard Corey down in the kitchen calling for him, saying to come down and join her. And so he went downstairs, he went into the kitchen, and immediately he saw his wife grinning ear to ear, and she promptly handed him a drink and said, I have big news and we're going to celebrate. And after the two of them went up to their bedroom, Corey told Eric all about this big real estate deal and how their company was about to profit $1 million. And then after that, they clinked their glasses together, said cheers, and took a sip from their cups. The drink that Corey made for both of them was called a Moscow Mule. It's made with ginger beer, vodka, and lime. But when Corey mixed Eric's Moscow Mule, she added one additional ingredient, a lethal dose of fentanyl. It would turn out Corey had been stealing money from Eric's bank accounts, and he had found out. Eric also had discovered that Corey had been taking out these massive loans in their family's name, which Eric was really upset about. In fact, Eric was so upset with Corey that he wanted a divorce and was talking to a divorce lawyer and making sure after the divorce was finalized that Corey could not touch his money. But perhaps sensing that a divorce was imminent and the money faucet would be turned off, Corey simply took out a $2 million policy on Eric and then killed him. And then shortly after that, in order to help her sons deal with the loss of their father, who she killed, she wrote a grief book about it and sold it for a profit. Police say Corey had been working for weeks to figure out the right fentanyl dose to give to her husband. On Valentine's Day that year, Corey had given Eric a poisoned sandwich that had fentanyl in it that she attached a love note to, but it obviously did not kill Eric. He just broke out in hives. So Corey got a stronger dose of fentanyl, she put it in his drink on March 3rd, and this time it worked. The story that Corey told first responders when they arrived to hopefully try to save Eric was that, they had had this celebratory drink, and then they went to bed, and then she had gotten up to see her son, and then, when she came back at 3 a.m., Eric was cold to the touch and she called 911. But in reality, after she poisoned her husband, and he's laying there still on the bed, slowly dying from this overdose, she just got up and paced around the house for several hours, Googling things like how to destroy electronic evidence and luxury prisons for the rich in America. These searches were, of course, the highly unusual and suspicious things that the police saw when they looked through all those devices during the initial part of the search. But as much as it made them think Corey likely had something to do with this, they didn't have enough to actually arrest her. However, after Corey published her grief book and went on this big tour promoting her grief book, Eric's family, who's watching this happen on TV and listening to the radios, they just couldn't take it. It disgusted them because they secretly believed that Corey had killed Eric over money. They didn't like Corey to begin with, and it just felt like she did this, and now she's profiting on Eric's death. And so family members began reaching out to police in Utah, and they said, you really need to look into Corey. We think she killed Eric. This whole grief book thing is a joke. She's a killer. Ultimately, it was those calls from Eric's family to the police, combined with Corey's very unusual and suspicious search history and electronic activity on the night that Eric died, that allowed police to arrest her at her home on May 8th, 2023. Corey, who denies any wrongdoing and says she did not kill her husband, is currently charged with aggravated murder, which could lead to the death penalty if she's convicted. She's being held without bail while she awaits trial, and her book, Are You With Me?, is no longer being sold on Amazon.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts.